I want you to move from overwhelmed by information to confident in what really matters. I want to help you move from being unsure towards direction and purpose in your healthcare. I want to introduce you to health experts. I want to let you in on tough conversations on women's health. I want to give you a place where you can lean in and learn how to take care of yourself. Let's transform your health. Let's get clear on your goals. This is Women's Health Unplugged. I'm your host, Dr. Jordan Robertson, naturopathic doctor. This episode of Women's Health Unplugged is brought to you by the Fundamentals of Macronutrient Tracking course that's been developed by myself and the nutritionist Carissa Stewart at Clarity Health. We have developed a 4-week introductory program for patients and the public to get better knowledge and more skill with respect to understanding their nutritional needs and how to move from feeling confused about each macronutrient, whether we're talking about protein, fats, or carbohydrates, to becoming more confident at making food choices regardless of their circumstances or the situation that they find themselves in. If you've ever found yourself at a barbecue not knowing what to eat, if you've ever taken a massive macronutrient out of your diet and was unsure if this was the right choice for you, this is a great starting point for you to learn more about the essentials of nutrition to help you feel accountable to our community and to get the knowledge and skills that you need to start feeling better about your nutritional health. The link to sign up for the program is in the show notes of the podcast, and the first class starts on November 15th. We hope you join us. This is a wonderful way for you to get more information about your nutrition and dip your toe in and learn more about how to support yourself through nutrition. Welcome to another episode of Women's Health Unplugged. This is going to be a good one. I am being joined by a guest today that has an area of expertise that I literally just turn a blind eye to most of the time in the research that I do. I'm joined by Emma Rohmann, who is an environmental engineer. She's going to talk today about toxins in your home, toxins in our cleaning products. I have to say, this is an overwhelming topic for me. So Emma, thank you so much for joining me on the show.
Thanks for bringing me on. I'm excited for this conversation.
I am too. And I will admit, so when I say I'm not an expert in environmental medicine, I'm being dead serious. There are some areas that I've explored as it relates specifically to some of the female gynecology conditions I have interest in, like endometriosis, which we can chat about a little bit. But I think my ignorance and turning a little bit of a blind eye around this conversation has a lot to do with how overwhelmed I feel on a personal level with this conversation. So I remember being in school, hearing everything is toxic, every placenta on earth is toxic. And at first feeling really empowered that I needed to make better choices and think about my own personal exposure. But then when I realized that it was unavoidable, or it felt unavoidable, I stopped, because I was like, if this is something I can't control, I can't put towards this energy and emotion towards it. And then I met you, and I will say you do this beautiful job of making this topic that is so big feel very accessible and possible. I would love if you could walk us through how you got to this place in your life and career and what you've built to help people make better choices.
Thank you. And I will say I was flattered that you reached out to have me talk about this, because I know it's not a topic. I listen to your show and I follow your stuff, and I really.
And you're like, where is the conversation on environmental medicine?
Yeah.
Why does she keep ignoring this?
So I am thrilled that you are willing to start navigating this, and completely appreciate how overwhelming it can feel. And I came at this from a bit of a roundabout way. So I'm an environmental engineer by education. And in university, I did a co-op program and did lots of different jobs and ended up in a career in green buildings. And so I started out with a passion for environmental issues. And my kind of overall mission was really grounded in helping the environment. as I got into green buildings more and started looking more at the impact that our indoor spaces have on our health, it kind of made me think about how I was doing things in my own life differently. So I started very gently, very slowly switching out cleaning products and personal care products. And then when I had kids, everything changed kind of in my brain. I just started thinking about things really differently and started doing more of a deep dive research into exactly what these chemicals and products we were using were doing to our health. Because when I was in university, I got on board quite quickly. I was like, okay, this makes sense. I'll switch to green cleaners. I learned what our water treatment plants could and could not remove. And that was a kind of a no brainer for me. But when it got into things like organic food and organic clothes and organic mattresses for babies and all of that stuff, I started to become a bit skeptical. And I didn't know if the information that I was reading, it was very one sided. It was very like, you should do all these things organic. I wanted to find out if it was actually important. And so I came at it with buy-in at first, but then a certain level of skepticism. Because quite frankly, I was starting to burn myself out trying to figure out what the best thing to do for my kids was. And I wanted to find out that I could go back and live like quote unquote normal person. And that little research project landed me in the total opposite direction. And I ended up creating Green at Home as a way to organize my thoughts in looking at both sides of a lot of these different issues. And it has snowballed from there. And so now I support families, people who are trying to conceive, people who are pregnant, in understanding what the best way to reduce their exposure to toxins is for them. Because I think there's a lot of very prescriptive, you must do XYZ out there. And that's not practical or sustainable to be following somebody else's vision of what that looks like. I think it's really important that we are empowered with the knowledge of how we can affect change in our own homes, in our bodies, for our children, and for the broader communities, so that we can implement steps that are doable and that will last. This isn't like, some people say when they get to a certain number of products or a certain place, they're kind of done. In my mind, this is a lifestyle, and it becomes just like, if you drink coffee or tea in the morning or lemon water, it's just part of your habit. It's part of who you are. It's part of how you operate. And my goal is to help people figure out what that looks like for them.
That's so great. I think, and what I love about what you do is just creating that like sort of digestible format, right? That this is a lifestyle, and that we are going to move towards something. Again, maybe like
Yes.
like versus like some of the ways even when we prescribe nutrition, right? Like that's a way better solution, is for people to move towards something better versus like a drop dead date, like now you eat like this, right? We know that creates more lasting change. But you brought up something interesting there around like how overwhelming it is for people to think about all the things they should be doing. And I think it's not uncommon for people when they're pregnant or have kids to start to think about, and like it's funny, people think about their nutrition better when they're pregnant too, right? They're like, well, now I'm not just eating for me, now I'm eating for my baby too. But I think there's a lot, like I worry about like the shame aspect and the blame aspect when it comes to teaching people and women about the environmental impact of what they're doing. Like how do you navigate that part of it? Because I think that's a thing that prevents people from even listening to the conversation in the first place.
Totally. And it's a really tricky balance and a bit of a tightrope walk, I think. But the way that I approach it, and I use a quote from Dr. Maya Angelou in a lot of my presentations before sharing what can be quite scary information. And that's do the best you can until you know better. And then when you know better, do better. And I think this conversation around shame, it gets a bit tricky, because just because you've learned something new that maybe if you had known it, you would have done it differently in the past, you can't act on information that you didn't have, right? And so learning something new, you now have a decision to make about how you use that information. And whether somebody takes that information and does nothing, or whether somebody takes that information and decides that they want to start making changes in their life, that's up to you, right? I'm not interested in saying, well, if you don't choose path B, then you're a terrible person. Like that would be shaming. So I think a lot of people think that shaming is teaching information, and therefore, if you're not going to use it, you're a bad person. I think there's a big leap there that, especially with Instagram and the internet, it can get convoluted. And so the way that I approach it is I share information. How you use it is up to you. And I think if it doesn't sit well with you, with how you want to take in that information and use it, then I think that's something that you need to kind of go within and decide what's going on and what's triggering and what you want to do differently. But at the end of the day, not talking about this is affecting our health. Not talking about this is causing harm. And so I feel like I have almost a duty to share what I've learned in a way that allows more people to get on board in a way that feels good for them.
So how bad is it for our health? Let's start there. That's the hook. How bad is it?
So that's a big question. And the short answer is it's bad. There's more and more research showing. So it's funny because when I started, I thought that I would be focused more on carcinogens. I have a family history of cancer. Cancer is what was getting talked about more, 20 years ago. Hormone disruptors weren't hitting the news. They weren't really a thing. Now my big focus is on hormone disrupting chemicals because of all of the research that is mounting about the impact that they are having is so broad, including cancer. But I've become kind of obsessed with hormones and you talk about them so much because they impact not only our quality of life, but they're responsible for so many different downstream effects as well. So I guess just to back up a little bit with what environmental health actually is, it's looking at aspects of our health that are impacted by our external environment. So what you talk about and most naturopaths and medicine talk about is kind of internal health and how our bodies affect us, whereas environmental health looks at the external factors, so not genetics, not physiology. And there are different things that play into this. Toxins is one aspect of it. And so the impact that toxins have vary. With hormone disrupting chemicals, for example, they are linked with, you mentioned endometriosis. So one common hormone disruptor, for example, are phthalates. They're in fragrance, synthetic fragrance. They're in soft plastics. They're in vinyl products. And studies have shown higher concentrations in women with endometriosis than without. And same with BPA. Studies have shown effects on estrogen levels, effect on immune system. So the effect on our hormones is kind of one small aspect that has a trickle-down effect into a number of different issues and conditions. And you mentioned the kind of toxic placenta. Studies have shown that children are being born kind of quote unquote pre-polluted is one of the very, I don't know, there's word choices to get people hooked, but pre-polluted is the name of one of the study reports. And so they're finding that there are these toxic chemicals in placentas. And so babies are born with an existing toxic load, toxic burden already. And so the idea that we can handle whatever we are exposed to doesn't necessarily apply to children, A, because they're already exposed before they're even born, and B, their detoxification systems, their immune systems, all of these different systems in their bodies aren't designed, they haven't developed yet to handle everything that is being thrown at them, which is contributing to impacts in those kind of critical development windows, which can then manifest into issues into adolescence, into adulthood, which makes it very difficult to pinpoint, right? It's not like, oh, you're going to use cream X, therefore you're going to develop condition Y in 20 years. It doesn't work that way. And so it makes the study and the conversation much more nuanced. And I think that's why it's taken so much time to build up, because the data hasn't had time to collect. But we are at the point now where the data is telling us a very clear story, and we're in trouble.
Yeah, I think when I look back, and you can correct me if I'm wrong about my interpretation of this, like when we first started talking about environmental toxins, we kind of talked about it the way we talk about like lead poisoning or mercury poisoning, where it was like you have to hit a certain amount and at that point you die, right?
Yes.
And so we developed a lot of our understanding of environmental medicine on there's some kind of threshold above which is terrible, below which we seem to be okay. And then we kind of set some standards around those things. And the way we thought about toxins was like a little bit is fine. And with the carcinogen, conversation of maybe 15 years ago, that kind of was true with certain exposures, right? Like high level exposure increases risk of cancer. Low level of exposure, we're not sure. And then as that conversation progressed to talking about hormone disruptors, we almost tried to apply the same logic to molecules that don't behave the same in the body. So saying like a little bit of BPA is cool, a lot of it is maybe going to be a problem. We're just applying that idea that like if you bathed in it, you'd die, but if you didn't, then you'd be okay, without realizing that like those like hormones act in like a parts per million part, like that's how that works. It's not about the load, right? It's about small messages. And even when we look at the way our body works under healthy conditions, we're talking about small messages that have big impact. And I can see that conversation around hormone disruption has shifted to say, actually, you know what? A little bit still does bad things and maybe big bad things. And because it's a little bit, that doesn't mean we're being saved. Is that accurate in kind of like framing it that way?
Absolutely. And the kind of old conversation around toxins was very much focused on the traditional toxicology belief, which is true to some extent, the dose makes the poison. But endocrine or hormone disruptors have disrupted that because they don't behave linearly. And so we know that certain hormone disruptors will have an impact at very low concentrations. They may not have an impact at medium concentrations. They might have an impact at high. The curves are not linear when we're talking about hormone disruptors. And because hormones are so good at their job and being such tiny molecules, hormone disruptors, which can mimic our natural hormones, I don't know that it takes a whole bunch of research to understand that a small molecule that mimics another small molecule can cause harm. But the studies are showing that this is exactly what's happening, as you said.
So when we think about like our home, right, I would love if we could start to think sort of like the practicality of breaking this down. Like what are I don't know, I feel like every question I'm about to ask sounds like one of those top 5 things that are going to poison you in your home. But I'm kind of curious, like if we wanted to break it down, like what are 3 areas of the home or personal life that we need to start examining, and how do we practically look at this?
Yeah, and this is where it gets a little bit, everybody wants to know, like, what's the one thing I can do?
I know. That is what I want to know.
I know. And it's tricky because everyone lives in a different environment, right? And so I think it takes a little bit of kind of looking around your space and understanding where you're at in terms of what's going on in your home. So if you're in a new home, for example, then the air quality of the building materials may be something that you need to tackle first. If you're in an older home and you're already, eating really kind of well, then maybe you can start looking at things like personal care products and other things. So I think it depends where you're at. That being said, there are some kind of key areas that I think everybody can look at to start lowering their exposure. And with my goal is not to get people to zero. That's impossible. So this whole conversation about going toxin free, chemical free is not a thing. So also, if you see people be like, I want something with no chemicals, not a thing.
Your banana has chemicals in it.
Yes, chemicals are not the bad guy here. Um, there are certain chemicals that are harmful. So the language, I think, needs to evolve a lot faster than it is in the space. I will say that upfront. And so when we're talking about reducing toxins, my goal is to get you to the point where you are lowering your body burden, essentially. So you're reducing the toxins in your environment so that what you are dealing with in your body isn't at an elevated level. So with hormone disruptors, yes, it's an element of it is accumulative as well, because some hormone disruptors like phthalates actually move through the body quite quickly. The problem is that they're found in just about all of us because we're being constantly bombarded. So when it comes to looking at what's in your environment, the goal is to reduce what's in your body so that things that you can't control, there will always be things you can't control, our bodies can then deal with it. And I've seen you talk about detoxification and how it's not really a thing. You don't need to worry about it because we've got detox systems. And that's true to a point, right? But we know that if your liver is sluggish or not able to detoxify things properly, then we can get into increased body burden. And it's kind of a chicken and egg, because if we are in inflamed state, if we are overburdened with toxins, then our detoxification systems can't work very well. So we need to reduce our exposure in order for our bodies to cope with everything else. That's my goal, not to get you to zero. So some of the main considerations in your home would be pesticides. More and more municipalities are restricting what kind of pesticides can be used outside, which is a really good thing. But there's still lots of home use pesticides going around. And then what's in your food and water. And so, again, this can come with a cost, and I'll give you some free/cheap ways to reduce your exposure in your home as well. But organic food, where you can, does matter. Studies repeatedly have shown that people who eat more organic food in their diet have lower concentrations of pesticides in their bodies. And we know that these pesticides are hormone disruptors. And so, yes, the residual amount on food is quite low. However, they build up. And same within our water. And so water filters are something that I think everybody who has the means to do, you should get the best water filter that you can afford. And if it's something that you need to save up for, then I think it's something that we should all plan for, because unfortunately, our drinking water systems just aren't, A, they aren't designed to remove everything that's ending up in our water, and B, our regulatory bodies are not set up to be health protective. And so the limits that we do have, drinking water is very highly regulated. However, the limits that we have for a lot of contaminants in our water don't consider children very well. It doesn't consider different health conditions very well. And so I think water is something that we drink all day, every day, hopefully. And it's something that we don't talk about enough in terms of quality. But it's a big conversation because water filters can be expensive. So that's kind of where you need to look at what you're spending money on and how you can kind of budget for some of those bigger things down the line. So as pesticides, the other ones, I mentioned phthalates before. Phthalates and Bpa are hormone disruptors that the studies just keep mounting and showing how these things are linked to, I mentioned endometriosis earlier, same with PCOS, linked with several different contaminants actually are linked with increased symptoms of PCOS. The relationship to developing it, I don't think is quite clear, but the expression of it is showing up to be pretty highly linked to increased concentrations of hormone disruptors. And some of the things we can't control, but what we can are plastics. So I don't pretend to have a plastic-free lifestyle. However, we can use these things in a way that isn't as impactful to us. So, like if you've got plastic lunch containers, for example, use them with food that is room temperature or cold. Don't heat food in plastic, or don't put hot leftovers in plastic and put it in the fridge. Um, Fragrance, as I mentioned, synthetic fragrance in personal care products and cleaners is a big one. And some building materials, which you may or may not be able to control, but knowing that they're in your house, you can then uh, address them better. So, dusting is one strategy that is not very many people like. I get that, but it's free and it is highly effective. Dusting and cleaning is one of the best ways, and opening your windows to flush out what builds up in your home over time. So, yeah, those are a few examples of things that you can start looking at.
I think, that's it's good perspective to think about, like, what it just kind of like that body burden. I like that term, and thinking about it, because for some people, that are trying to consider where to place their resources or where to spend their emotion and energy in terms of learning about, it's going to vary from person to person. As you were speaking there, I was thinking, well, the person who, has terrible eczema, I mean, first of all, they should just go see their naturopath. But a person who has terrible eczema and has to use a lot of cream may reconsider that part of their environmental exposures earlier than someone who never puts cream on, right? But who does other, things, or who has maybe a brand new home. And so you're right, like, just thinking about it as far as like your own personal exposure, and trying to prioritize what's going to make the most sense for you as a person, and that will have the greatest impact on your body burden. I give patients, when patients ask about organic, and I'm like, well, like, what's possible, right? Like,
Hmm.
what's possible for you? And there's many ways to think about those strategies. You could just buy the cheapest organic food, right? Buy organic soy, buy organic bananas, or like, get the things that are the cheapest, and everything else, fine. You could get the things that, are maybe the most affected, or that have the greatest, exposure to pesticides. You could get the things that, you don't use that often, because then it's maybe less expensive. There's lots of different ways that you can kind of frame it, and that's much more positive than saying, like, the finger wagging, you have to eat organic.
Absolutely. And I think regardless of what people's lifestyle or what they're doing currently, I usually start them off with personal care and cleaning products, because they're small incremental changes, and it gets you in the habit of thinking about things a little bit differently, reading labels, paying attention to how things are made. And so if you're at the grocery store trying to figure out whether you should buy the organic apple or non-organic apple, I think there is a definite kind of cost benefit that goes into that analysis. And sometimes I go to the grocery store and I'm like, everything I buy is organic. And other times I look at the prices and I say, F that. And I go with conventional. It kind of depends on my attitude on the day as well. But, it's what you do most of the time is going to have a greater impact than random one off things that you're doing only occasionally. And so I think being able to pick an area of focus that you want to have and feel really comfortable with the decisions you're making in that area, and then move on to the next. And so it's not like you're going to go and wipe out your entire skincare collection and go through your cupboards and buy 100% organic on the same day. You want to focus on things that you feel are achievable for you. And I think that snowball effect can go a long way. So even if you're going to pick something that may not have a huge impact on your overall body burden, if you're making progress, it's going to make those bigger changes much easier, because you've already started along the way. You can build up that kind of self-congratulation that you're making change, and it will help with those bigger rocks that may feel like an insurmountable obstacle right now. But I think a lot of people get really stuck on those really hard or big changes, and it stops them from looking at the smaller things that they could be doing. Or similarly, they get stuck in this wheel of switching over their skincare and cleaners and then constantly chasing the next quote unquote clean brand. And so, you switch to some brand of makeup or cleaning product and you like it. And then, oh, this other brand comes up, or your friend tells you about this other brand. You're like, oh, this is new. I should try that one. Well, you were already using a perfectly good product that you liked. Like, keep using it. Don't keep chasing something new, and move on to another area of your home where you're ignoring, probably because it's more difficult than switching to some shiny new product that you don't need to change. Those are kind of the hurdles that I see people get trapped in the most, is this constant cycle of either not taking action or taking action on things that you don't need to.
It's all the targeted marketing
Totally.
on Instagram. It's making me feel like I need to get a new skin cream every couple of days. Although I will say, like, watching that industry shift. So when I was in school, I worked at one of like the largest health food stores in Toronto. I worked at the Big Carrot
Oh, yeah.
for years. And I remember when I first started and I was like, I'm going to change all my personal care products to something more natural. And what it felt like at the time was that we were always compromising performance of the product for, right? Like I remember being like, this is what my hair gets to look like if I
Yep.
choose a natural product. Like, this is what deodorant, like, there is no option. There's no like in between. You either choose something like horrifically toxic or you smell, right? Like there wasn't this in between choice. Whereas I actually find the performance of some of my natural products equal or superior to, like they've come a long way.
100%. When I started this, like, finding deodorant was painful. It took me like literally 10 years, and I don't even know how many products. It was insane. And so starting now, it is so much easier than it was 15, 20 years ago. And I think some people might have some kind of residual PTSD if they tried a
Yes.
single natural deodorant 15 years ago, and therefore decide that all natural deodorant doesn't work. So yes, it has come a long way. The other thing that I want to say on performance is, a lot of people say, what is a healthy alternative to X product that behaves just like the product that I want to replace? However, and I'll use Teflon as an example in cookware. People want a healthy alternative to Teflon that works exactly like Teflon. Teflon is one of the, it should just it should not be made anymore. It uses PFAS chemicals. It's a class of chemical that is used in a bunch of waterproofing and stainproofing. Dental floss even uses it. It is highly environmentally pervasive. It is contributing to widespread contamination, and it's toxic to our health. Now, in a frying pan, it's not terrible. I don't tell people to throw out their perfectly good Teflon frying pans. Use it on low heat, always with food in it. When it gets scratched, get rid of it and replace it with something else. But when people say, I want something that performs just like Teflon, it's like, well, Teflon is the slipperiest substance in the world. It does a phenomenal job at nonstick cookware because of its toxic chemical properties. We do not want products that perform just like the products that are harming our health. We want products to do the job well, but we need to kind of shift what that definition of performance is. So we want a frying pan that we can cook pancakes and eggs in without it sticking to the pan, right? And so you can achieve that with cast iron. And so, but cast iron is very different than Teflon. It takes a totally different kind of maintenance and cooking style, but it is totally doable. And so I think we need to stop thinking that we want something to recreate the toxic product at that price, because we want to get away from that.
Yes, I know. I was thinking about that. Like, I remember like buying some hair, like more natural hairspray, and I was like, "Where's the propellant?"
Yeah.
Right? Like, and then like, oh, like that's the reason it's better is because it doesn't have a propellant in it. That it's so you're right. Like, and I think that's a really good sort of mindset shift. Is that like, quite often the performance that we're looking for is something that isn't, I'm going to use the word natural. I maybe don't love that word, and I'm
I
sure
know
you don't love
it's,
that word either,
yeah.
but it's like the reason it does the thing that it does is because we've created it, and that creation is the problem, right? Like that's, and so maybe we need to change some of our expectations. I don't love changing the expectations of my over easy eggs, but I understand what you're saying.
Well, and we have a very picky over easy egg family here, and I am a cast iron convert. I was so hesitant. My husband was actually the one that suggested it as an alternative because that's what he grew up with, and now it's all I use. So,
I'll have to give that a go, because I have a great cast iron pan that I absolutely love, actually. I want to talk a little bit about just social responsibility here. And this is kind of the icky part of the conversation. I mean, the whole conversation can be a little bit icky. We're trying to make it fun. Um, but this is a little bit of like the icky part of the conversation, because I think as an individual, and often when we're consuming this kind of information, we're doing it for ourselves, right? We're doing it for ourselves, and maybe like by extension, our kids or our family. Um, but we've got the person who's listening, who's thinking, you know what, I only use that under eye cream like 3 days per week. Really, I don't think it really matters if I, get something that is less toxic. My personal exposure to this product is minimal, and therefore I'm okay with it, right? We do think so much about ourselves in this conversation about, toxicity. We get marketed to that way too.
mhm.
There is a bigger part of this conversation, because it's not just about you, actually. And part of the bigger conversation is about like the, society impact, the global impact. How, let's talk about that social responsibility piece.
And this is another piece that drives me a little bit up the wall when people say we don't need to be concerned about the small amounts of ingredients in products, because it forgets the entire upstream part of the supply chain. And so, yeah, like eye cream or Teflon is a good example, because the exposure, yes, you can get some exposure from a pan, but it's going to be quite small. However, and if you haven't seen the movie Dark Waters, or the devil we know, are great documentaries on Teflon in particular that really drive home the impact that these chemicals are making upstream. And so if we just say, oh well, this amount in a product is really low, it doesn't matter, you're forgetting that people are handling these chemicals in their full strength concentration. You're forgetting that these chemicals are manufactured somewhere, and there is a plant with effluent that is running into waterways that are then supplying drinking water to communities. And so we are taking great advantage of a global economy and a global supply chain without considering the impact globally. So it's very one sided. And I get that not all of us can think this way. Some people are in a state where they're in such self-preservation in this moment that all they can handle is survival. I get that. But there is a large number of people who do have the ability to think bigger than them and choose not to. And I think we need to change that, because if we keep boiling it down to the lowest common denominator of a little bit won't impact us, we're forgetting everything else. And the impact that individuals can make might be small, but collectively, if we start asking questions of companies about the chemicals that they're using, if we stop buying them, and also the way that we vote and talk to our elected officials about regulating these chemicals, we can see a much bigger shift that will support people who don't have the choice, that have to work in these manufacturing plants, that have to drink the water in these communities before they find out that they're being poisoned. And I think we have a responsibility, and we owe that to people that we are benefiting from by using these products.
Right. So to work backwards from that chain there, right? I'm going to go back to my eye cream. I don't know why. Maybe I'm looking at myself on Zoom, feeling like my 40 years here. But that one jar of cream, right, that you put on a couple of days per week, like somehow that got to you, right? Flown over hell's half acre, probably. Someone put it in that jar. Someone tested that product. Someone breathes in those fumes all day on some kind of assembly line, there. And then you're right, like with the community. So like, and even if we want to think about like that global piece, like there are so many people along that chain that brought you the cream that, yeah, like you put a micron on a couple days a week for your wrinkles for a small investment in a product that doesn't have that that trail of destruction behind it, that you can have a big impact, right? And I think you're right. Like when we talk about like the toxicity piece, we always make it about like, oh, a little bit isn't going to harm you. And so it's not important for you to make those changes, but it's not just about you. It's not just about your eye cream. It's that eye cream is being made en masse by someone somewhere. There's lots of people being exposed to that cream and all the chemicals that come in that cream, probably supporting industries in general that maybe don't have great, employee structure. Like all, like it can go, they get really big, right? Like
Yeah.
when you go like pull a cream off the shelf at the drugstore, what are you voting for?
Yeah. And that's the other case with organic food that gets missed in the conversation, where people say, oh, the residual amount's not very much. You can wash it off, blah, blah, blah. True. To some extent, some of the pesticides are actually in the food itself, but you're ignoring the farmers who are applying these pesticides. You're ignoring the impact that pesticides are having on waterways. And we may not even be talking about faraway communities in other countries. In some respects, we're talking about the water that you yourself are drinking as well. And so we know that farm workers are at increased risk of infertility, certain cancers. Like this is known. And so by saying that if you have the option and the ability to buy organic and you're choosing not to because you don't think it impacts your health, I think we all need to pause and think about that impact. And, you know, it's cleaning products, same thing. Millions of us are literally flushing cleaning products down the drain. There is no, like, the drain goes to our water. It's that when you throw something in the garbage, when you flush something down the sink, there is no away, as that there's a quote block or meme or something. It goes somewhere. And we forget that. We forget because we have flush toilets and running water and underground sewage conveyance systems and garbage pickup at the curb. It just disappears. But we need to realize that it doesn't just disappear. And we need to take ownership of our decisions and actions and what that is doing in a broader context.
Yeah, I've had that conversation with my dad before because I feel like when he talks about food, he just talks about how much the food costs. And we've talked about, I'm like, how is a chicken over here like $7, an entire chicken, and a chicken over here is $25? Like if something is cheap, we paid for it somewhere,
Yeah. Or somebody else paid for it.
or someone else paid for it. Yeah, like it's being paid for. A chicken is a chicken, right?
Yes.
And if we made the chicken cheaper, we paid for it somewhere. And I think that like that part of the conversation I think is important because it's, maybe we have a perfectly healthy person who's in the audience going, okay, like this is nice. I can see, but I really love the mousse I use in my hair. And I'm really like, I don't know. It's easy to deflect like what our personal responsibility is if we don't have a huge red flag. There are patients who they can't ignore this conversation, right? Because it does impact them as an individual. But I do think it's a cool, like bigger social responsibility conversation that we're not having often enough to say like, well, how are we impacting like the entire community by maybe drawing attention to some of these pieces? Because the more we ask for products, like now, like the products that are out there are amazing, because we're asking for it, right? Like we're
Yep.
asking for those things to change. And like suddenly we have little dryer tabs and things that like did not exist 15 years ago. because we're asking for it.
Yep, absolutely.
So I would love to sort of for you to share sort of your final words of wisdom, Emma. And I also want to hear where we can contact you because the information that you put out is so great. But to kind of think sort of practically, how can our audience take like something away from today and go like, I'm going to look at these like 2 or 3 things immediately and know that I'm actually making a change. Like, what are your, and I know you said, what's the one thing, and but like, if you had your way and you got to stand on a soapbox, which is kind of what podcasting is, and say, I want you to do these 3 things, like, what would it be? And that's not just for the individual. I'm thinking like about the bigger purpose here too.
I think number one is being a more conscious consumer in general, taking the time to read labels, understand where your products are being made, who's making them, and what kind of social responsibility the companies that you're buying from have. And so you're not going to get it perfect right away. I think the first step is really just to read the labels and start developing that skill. And the more that you read them, the more that things will jump out at you and you'll start to be like, that's interesting. And reading beyond the BPA free kind of messaging and the greenwashing. So it's just being more aware of what you're being marketed, I think is step one. As I mentioned, I think most people can stand to start looking at their personal care and cleaning products. That's where the majority of people begin. And so reading those ingredients and understanding what you're using, I recommend picking the top like 3 to 5 products, depending on how product heavy you are, that you use all the time and that stay on your skin. So like sunscreen is a big one for me, being a redhead. I wear it all the time, all over. So sunscreen, deodorant, face cream maybe that you're using in an area, and understand the ingredients that are in there and what you want to be avoiding. Same with cleaning products because they impact the air that you are breathing. And you can replace those fairly easily because they're consumable. So I usually say like use up what you have and then find a replacement before you run out so that you're not running to the drugstore to buy the normal thing because you suddenly have no deodorant. So do your research ahead of time and then replace them as they run out. And third is, as I mentioned, looking at your indoor air quality. It can be as simple as opening your windows and honestly dusting and vacuuming a little more frequently. It's a really great way to deal with the stuff that you can't get rid of right away. And so sometimes reducing toxins isn't about switching out products, it's just about mitigation.
I love that. Thank you. And that's very practical. I love that. Well, I love that dusting is part of the solution.
I know.
I'll have to get my husband to listen to this episode. I'm just kidding. He does all the dusting. Okay, so where can we find you? Because you put out such practical, great information. I definitely I'm cautious when I work with people that are having this conversation because I do think it can be I'd like your term greenwashing. I know that's a common one that we hear talked about where we basically are making everything sound like it's really exciting and environmentally low impact when that may be not the case. Where can our audience learn more about what you do and access your information?
Yeah, so you can find just about everything I do at greenathome.ca. I have a podcast called The Missing Pillar of Health podcast and a Facebook group called the Green Product Forum.
Amazing. We'll put
and
the links to
Instagram.
that. And your Instagram and your cute little Instagram dances are totally worth following you on Instagram for. And we'll put all of those links in the show notes so it's an easy click through for everyone who's listening. Emma, thank you so much for spending time with me today.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate that you're having this conversation.
I hope you enjoyed that episode of Women's Health Unplugged. My goal is to help you feel more confident about your health. Please remember that what we talked about today in the podcast does not constitute medical advice, nor was a doctor-patient relationship formed. If you have questions about your healthcare or about how today's topic pertains to you, please take it up with your family doctor, your specialist, or someone on your health team.